So hello everyone, welcome to the fifth lecture in this ongoing series of Stanton Lectures. Now, the lecturer this year is Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad from Lancaster. And just in case you are joining us for the first time today, just to let you know quickly that what's happening here is that Professor Ram-Prasad is developing a series of dialogical conversations across Sanskritic and non-Sanskritic borderlines. And in the first two lectures, the first pair, the focus was on contrast. It was contrastive. In the third and the fourth lectures, the second pair, the focus was on complementarity. And today and the next lecture on Thursday on Ramanuja and Ibn Arabi, two figures, extremely important philosophers, theologians who are roughly contemporaneous, the focus is going to be comparative. So over to you, Ram.
Thank you for your introduction, Uncle. So exactly as Uncle was saying, I've been moving through different ways of juxtaposing two thinkers, one from Sanskritic and one from a non-Indian tradition. And as we saw in each case, I took this idea of oneness in different ways. So with Shankara and Chuang-Tzu, I was approaching their idea of oneness as expressing a sense of alienation or disquiet over the difference between the subject and the world in which it finds itself. And so the overcoming of it. In the case of Shankara, through the transformation of consciousness to the realization that the world actually dissolves into the consciousness of the self, which is a universal consciousness, and with Chuang-Tzu, a sense of acting in the world in such a way that estrangement from it dissolves oneself into the way, the Tao. So this is not comparing Brahman and Tao. This was not comparing their methodologies, but rather saying that starting from this point of feeling that there was something wrong in the sense of the difference between a pluralistic world and individuals, they set off in two different directions, two different modes of analyses, and two different responses. Then in the pair of Abhinava and Spinoza, we had this discussion about their notion of oneness in terms of the metaphysical position of monism, of saying that the world of plurality, the world of objects and subjects, was in fact constituted in some way of the same stuff, God, which the two of them expressed in different ways. Abhinava primarily through reference to the notion of consciousness and light, and Spinoza through substance and a rather problematic relationship with identification of God and nature. And there too, what we found was that they gave a similar, comparable analysis of the world of plurality in which they found themselves. But Abhinava's primary method of progression was through reasoning to a point of transformative consciousness, transformative understanding. And later in some of our discussion, it was suggested that one way of looking at it is that it was a first personal point of view, how to progress when consciousness confronts this plural world. Whereas Spinoza's account, at least in the main body of the first book of the Ethics, for example, was broadly a third person point of view, a way of analyzing the world through what he called the geometric method, to say that what we really find of necessity is that there is, in fact, only one substance, God, thereby logically establishing that the world of plurality is in fact God. So what I've been therefore doing is both interpreting what oneness means in these two pairs differently, and also how the relationship between them, the juxtaposition between them as being of different types, one of contrast and the second of complementarity. Today and Thursday, I'm going to be doing what will be what's a straightforward comparison of Ramanuja and Ibn al-Arabi. Al-Arabi lived slightly later than Ramanuja, and to the best of our knowledge, there was no contact or knowledge between the two traditions. Yet, reading them, one is compelled to think about similarities in their responses to many different issues. I'm only going to pick one particular line of thinking. But today I'll start with sketching out what I think is comparable about them, and then go on to talk about Ramanuja. I just want to say, I promised him that I'm going to embarrass him. I'm delighted to have Professor Julius Lipner here. It was reading his book on Ramanuja, The Face of Truth, that opened up for me the possibility of thinking about my own tradition, the Sri Vaishnava tradition of Ramanuja, in a different way than perhaps I'd been brought up to think. So I'm very happy to have him here. Ibn Arabi, as a potential interlocutor, came to my mind over many years of discussion in the past with my colleague at Lancaster, Dr. Shurub Naguib. And it was in describing some of what I was doing on Ramanuja that led to her comment that perhaps Ibn Arabi was the person for me to think about in her own tradition. And I scoured the literature to try and find any such comparison. I had met one or two scholars from Turkey who had said that they had heard about a potential comparison between him and Shankara, but not of Ramanuja. It was only recently that I actually found that there is a paper by our own Ankur Barua and Hina Khalid, in which a sketch of a comparison is made. So I'm delighted that there is, in fact, the beginnings of a comparative study of these two thinkers. But just to reiterate, there are many things that could be compared about them, but I'm picking a particular course through my comparison within the context of ways of oneness. And this is the challenge as I see it, facing both of them, as well as perhaps other monistic theists. On the one hand, an absolute metaphysics of oneness, saying there is only one stuff from which all these pluralities come, leaves no space for divine disclosure if the one is God. For if all is one, then to whom and what would divine disclosure be? That raises questions about how to think of such oneness as God at all. So you could have, of course, ways in which the idea of divine disclosure, the idea of the reception of the divine by human worshippers and devotees might be set aside completely. So if there is a rigorous metaphysics of oneness, which does not have this idea of a person God who is worshipped every day, who is the orientation of human beings in their devotion, then you might have other kinds of metaphysical challenges, but you would not have this particular one. Which is why, of course, in much of the theistic traditions of the world, a pluralistic metaphysics of duality most frequently suggests itself. Because then, if there is God, and then a world of things and beings created or in some profound way dependent on God, then there is clarity in the metaphysical structure of this reality as to how and to whom God discloses, self-discloses. For it is to this world that has been created or in some way brought into being. So what is the oneness of the one God that contains everything, so is not in fact located within a pluralist metaphysics, and yet self-discloses? In order to accommodate a metaphysics of oneness, and yet also a self-disclosing God, a God who is available in some way through grace to worshippers or devotees or believers, all being must be God. That's the requirement, of course, of oneness. And there must not be beings which are other kinds of beings, such that God is, say, the supreme being, so that God is not ontotheologically a supreme being amongst beings. So the oneness of God's being should not allow of that kind of critique that God is conceived simply as a supreme being. And yet, God must somehow relate to subjects and objects, plural subjects and objects of this world, in such a way that they are at one and the same time derivative of or somehow part of God's being, and yet sufficiently different to be disclosed to. So God must, I've chosen a word that does not come directly from the traditions, infuse being into things and beings. So that you have things that contain the possibility to exist as creation. So it's not an illusory world generated from cosmic or an individual consciousness, but things exist, have their own ontology, have their own classificatory structures, and yet must contain the possibility of existence only through God's being. And there must be beings such as us, subjective beings, that who contain the possibility within themselves of choosing that existence with God, so that in their modes of life, they can exercise their agency in relating to God, as we will see, in being open to the grace of God's self-disclosure. So there must be this world of things and beings, subjects and objects, and yet how they are, what their being consists in, must somehow be through the infusion of God's being into them. So what we are going to see in these two lectures is a sort of different conceptual vocabulary and the different mechanisms of explanation through which Ramanuja and Ibn Arabi lay out this requirement for the absolute oneness of God's being, consistent with God's self-disclosure to us. So when we look at Ramanuja, we see that he expresses this position through taking the oneness of the ground of being, Brahman, that from which all grows, and qualifying it, as the word goes, makes a particularity of it that somehow derives its existence from Brahman. So he, for example, calls up the phrase from the Chandogya Upanishad, that is Brahman, willed, I shall be many. So there is only one, and I shall be many. Ramanuja reads it neither as the generation of a non-ultimate, non-real many, as Shankara would, nor does he read it as merely the coming into creation as distinct, as many other systems, Nyaya or Dvaita Vedanta would. How he reads it, that is to say, dualist Vedanta would, what he says is that when Brahman says, I shall be many, at one and the same time, two things are held in apparent tension, which is the I that is Brahman, which is only one, and it's making many through this derivation of being from itself. This Brahman, for Ramanuja and his system, is worshipped as Vishnu, Narayana, God. And the way the relationship between the being of God and that which God wills is through treating Brahman as both the material and the instrumental cause of the world. At least these are the standard translations, and I don't want to go into challenging why we should read them in any other way. So I should simply say that what I understand by upadana here, normally translated as material cause, is that whatever consists of the entitativeness of things, that is to say their being, that being is Brahman's own being. And at the same time, it is not some kind of a necessary evolute. It is the willing of Brahman that brings about the structures of things that are. And that is why God is also, Brahman as God, is instrumental. So from God's being comes the world, and God makes the world be. Ibn Arabi also talks about there being only God, that is to say, there's only God has being, and yet God is distinct from, in some fundamental way, and the things to which God discloses himself. By talking of being, the philosophical term that is equivalent to Allah. The things and beings of creation exist insofar as they are identical to being. If they were not of being, they would not exist. They would not exist. And he does this by tracing it back to the Quranic saying, be and it is, the divine fiat. So again, like with I shall be many, this can be interpreted, of course, in fundamentally different metaphysical ways. It can have a pluralist metaphysics. And because you could say that what is created is distinct from God. And in fact, there is an absolute distinction between God's being and the things that God brings about, for example. But Ibn Arabi does not read it in that way. So in this comparison, I tentatively explore how the transcendent rigor of the God of unicity, transcendent in the Kantian sense of being absolutely beyond anything, any reach of our understanding and sensibility, is worked by each of Ramanuja and Ibn Arabi into an account of being, God's being, and the self-disclosure of that being to the beings that God has brought about. So it is this, there seems to be a requirement for plurality or manyness from the viewpoint of believers, worshippers, devotees. Because something is being disclosed to them, something that they worship, something that they open to the reception of, something whose grace enables them to have this understanding. And yet, at the same time, there is no distinction between the beings to whom there is self-disclosure and that which self-discloses. That is the particular parallel that I'm going to explore in these two talks. And as I was saying, as I was over the years, read and thought through the little that I can understand of Ibn, there are so many astonishing parallels about the hierarchy of beings, about the plurality of parts within the traditions, the idea of love, the centrality of love, the notion of servanthood. They could occupy other lives and other lifetimes to study. There is so much that needs to have fevered dreams in which somewhere between Baghdad and Srirangam, sometime in the middle of the 13th century, I had a study in which the two of them were talking to each other. I would go to bed with my head swimming with these parallels and had to pull myself back and say, this would be incoherent to try and run off in all these different astonishing directions and look at how one might think of some kind of similarities of responses to the most fundamental questions that metaphysical theologians have faced. So I'm just going to follow, in the time I have, this very particular question. So we'll start with Ramanuja, whose dates are not very clear. He was born in the deep south of India, in the Tamil, what is now the Tamil country. He was born into this community that was just emerging, which take the loving worship, devotion or bhakti to God in the form of the divine couple Narayana. Shri. Shri is his consort and represents the grace of God. Ramanuja in particular fused the devotional theopoetics that existed in the tradition, the community tradition before, with the metaphysics of the ancient Upanishads. So that famously you have the two forms Vedanta, the Ubhaya Vedanta, which combines both the devotional approach of the mystic poets who preceded him and the rigorous metaphysical analysis and path of knowledge that he found in the Upanishads and in the Vedanta Sutras, so the Brahma Sutras, which we encountered with Shankara too. So this is why he's known as the great teacher of Acharya. So let us start looking at some of the elements I want to assemble in Ramanuja's own considerable oeuvre. So most of the time I'm going to be looking at his commentary on the Vedanta Sutras or Brahma Sutras, the single line summaries of the teachings of the Upanishads that predate him by about 1,200 years, and the text which is called the Sri Bhashya. And by the word Brahman is named the first person, Purushottama. People have given many translations of Purushottama, foremost, supreme, or ultimate. I use first person in the sense of indicating that our very conception of persons, of individuals, those who worship, those who live, those who act, those who pray, derives from, in this tradition, the supreme conception of what it is to be person, which is God himself. It is from Purushottama, whose essence, Svabhava, all flaws are excluded, and who has the collection of all auspicious qualities, which are of unsurpassable eminence and infinite. For everywhere, the quality attributed to Brahman is maximum. So our ideas of goodness, of knowledge, of power, of grace, of love, all of these qualities are at their maximum in this God. And the primary referent of maximality is the one in whom it is of unsurpassable eminence, both in essence, Svarupa, and by every attribute. That is to say, you cannot derive the conception of what these great eminent qualities are, except insofar as they are essentially God's. And at the same time, while these ideas are essentially derived from them, their being part of what God is, we are able to use them attributively of God. So we kind of hand back to God that which comes from God. So when we talk of God as loving and gracious and all-powerful and all-knowing, we are deriving from and yet giving back to God quality. So this is the ground. So everything comes and goes back into God who's Brahman. And yet, within that framework, although we know these ideas come and go back into God, we try and explain to ourselves how we are able to use these attributes as the sacred texts talk about them. And Ramanuja provides the analysis of many such qualifications of Brahman that are found in the Upanishads. I'm just going to use a passage about one of those, which is when it says that Brahman is real being, Satya, sentience, jnana, and infinitude, Ananta. This text tells us that God's essence is marked off from all else. Here the phrase Satya, real being, says that Brahman has unconditioned existence. Indeterminate, cannot be circumscribed. This distinguishes him from insentient matter that is subject to change, and from sentient beings like us, which are linked to that matter in the created world through our bodiliness. Since both have the possibility of entering various states under different names, which excludes them from the possibility of unconditioned being. You see why here is a place where there's potential for an entirely different comparison, which is Ramanuja and Spinoza. We talk about why the indeterminacy or unconditioned nature of being is different from the derivative being that we have, that the world has, the plural world has. Because it's not real being, it's not Satya, because that which does not change is the being of God. So the being that is borrowed and given by God to subjects and objects is not real being, because these beings and entities, they change over time. That is why the sacred texts make the distinction between God as real being and the world of subjects and objects, which are not real being, secondary. In the same way, the word sentience, jnana, indicates a state of eternal, uncontracted awareness, unlike awareness that is found in subjects like us, whose being is infused by God's. Because, of course, our consciousness varies, goes up and down, increases, decreases, ends with the cessation of the body, and so forth. The word infinitude, ananta, describes its essence as free from all limitations of place, time, or particularities. Since attributes are possessed by essence, both attributes and essence are infinite. So you can have a straightforward comparison with Spinoza here. So the idea is that the essence of God is infinite, and of course, we have attributes that do not have that essential finitude. So here is an example in which, in this trio of words, reality, knowledge, and finitude, the sacred texts strive to somehow mediate between that which is beyond all description and yet also makes itself available through that description. And the way to do so is to make a distinction between the being that is in itself and these derivative modes in which subjects and objects in the world are. So not only are there such distinctions, it's also the case that this is so because God makes subjects and objects, the world, be. It's not, as I said, an automatic sort of evolution of the world. The world is not simply an evolute of some ultimate principle. It is rather that God makes the world be. So to use a passage from his early work, the Vedanta Sangraha, the essential form, Swarupa, of the inner controller, Antaryamin, that is to say, that which, when we think of ourselves as having independent consciousness, we do not. Our consciousness is, in fact, consciousness which is in some form a qualification of the ultimate being who's God. So God is present in us, as the inner controller, is a favorite phrase that Ramanuja has. He is the sole cause of the existential condition, the samsara of origination, stability, and dissolution of the manifold world, which consists of sentient and insentient entities, and of the cessation of this world. His essential form is therefore distinct from all entities other than himself, since he is absolutely opposed to all flaws, such as the world has, and comprises only of infinite perfection. His host of auspicious attributes are immeasurable, perfect, and countless. He is known in the entire Veda, the sacred text, under the various designations of the self of all, ultimate Brahman, ultimate light, ultimate principle, ultimate self, real being, etc., all of which denote Lord Narayana, the first person. So there is a way in which, as the sole cause, there is an indication that, as effect, the world is, in its being, deriving its entitativeness from God, from Lord Narayana. He is the sole cause of the existential condition of subjects and objects in that plurality. And yet, his essential form is distinct because God is not in any way flawed. So what we are going to see, and I'm just going to indicate where we are going with this, is that there are two ways in which this kind of absolute oneness of being of God in its relationship to subjects and objects works. On the one hand, there is the absoluteness by which nothing that we can say or do or conceive, nothing that is qualitatively of this world, has any bearing on God. So there is an absoluteness to God's being that's beyond the reach of all of the subjects that talk about him, worship him, and so forth. But there is also another more dynamic relationship, which is that the qualities that we recognize, we know, the things we talk about in terms of such things, virtues, good qualities, and love, grace, and so forth, we can see and understand in our own limited ways, express and manifest in this world. But in God alone are they maximal and infinitely perfect. So these qualities are imperfectly found amongst the beings that come from God. But the relationship of them with God is that God has them in perfection. So on the one hand, there is the absolute difference where God's godliness, the absoluteness of God, has nothing to do with any features of our understanding. And there is also the way in which we have an understanding of qualities whose relationship to God is that we see them in imperfect, flawed ways, and they are perfect. So there is this attempt to mediate in different ways the relationship between the being of beings and the one being that is God. So to use a slightly different way of looking at this, in the Sri Bhashya again, although Brahman enters into the condition of effect, that is to say, subjects and objects, it is well established, i.e. by the teachings of the sacred text, that Brahman is unchanged because there is no alteration in his essence, Svabhava. Being an effect is well established that there is a world. It is a condition of being the very self of sentient and insentient entities in their grossly manifest conditions of being distinguished by separate names and forms. And being an effect is simply entering into another condition. So we have to keep these two thoughts in mind. And we're going to see, of course, I'll be expressing it in a slightly different way, which is that there is Brahman, and Brahman is essentially unchanged as the cause. But in the condition of effect, in the beingness of entities, subjects, and objects, Brahman is in another condition. That is to say, the condition of flawed, imperfect, transient, grossly manifest states. So it is this dialectic between holding the oneness of Brahman unchanged and yet saying that the world, which is everything in its qualitativeness that is different from Brahman, is yet Brahman, because that's what it is for Brahman, for there to be only one being. This effort to mediate is the constant battle that someone like Ramanuja faces. So you've got to say that there is another condition, and the condition is everything that Brahman in himself is not, God in himself is not. And yet, what God is not is also another condition of God. That's the central paradox. Primary meaning of texts expounding untransformed Brahman is given by that denial that his essential form evolves. So this is the absolute being of Brahman. Untransformed, unconditioned. There is no evolution. There are no evolutes of subjects and objects. Those declaring that he is without attribute are taken as denying that he has the defiling attributes of materiality, the world, and its conditions. Those that deny diversity are rightly preserved because they signify that Brahman, because he's a self of all, takes all sentient and insentient entities as modes that constitute his body. And having everything as its modes, he alone abides. So in this one passage, Ramanuja again tries to say, look, why do the sacred texts say these two things? On the one hand, they want to talk about the qualityless, attributeless, absolute Brahman. And therefore, they look at Brahman, or they talk of Brahman as that which has no attributes. It's just a denial that Brahman is these things. And yet, there are also texts that talk about the world. And yet, in talking about the world and its diversity, they're not giving up on the oneness of God. How can that be? How can they deny diversity? Well, because although Brahman is untransformed as Brahman and is non-evolute, Brahman is also the self of all, takes subjects and objects as modes of being. And since we know that Brahman is one, the diversity of the world, it's not apparent, it's there. But Brahman does not devolve into diversity. That diversity is still contained in Brahman because it's only the one Brahman that takes on these modes. It would have been easier, of course, for a pluralist theologian to say that on the one hand we have that God who is untransformed, and then there is the world that is transformed by God. But that would then be, and a difference would be affirming a difference between God and world, which Ramanuja cannot. So how is he going to do it? He's going to say that even when you look at that world, you must nevertheless see in the sacred text a denial of diversity, because these are only modes of God. Raising, of course, the challenge to him, if these are modes, and modes, of course, are changing all the time, we know that. Beings, objects come and go, human beings come and go, and so on. How can you say that there is also an untransformed Brahman? Is Brahman not being transformed? So a lot turns on this notion of modality. Modality is the means by which there is both just the oneness of Brahman, whether Brahman is seen as beyond any transformation, or whether Brahman is seen as a set of transformations that constitute the world. Similarly, he says, rightly preserved are the passages which declare that he himself is not characterized by his modes, his master and sovereign of all, the possessor of all auspicious attributes, eternally makes his desires true, ever accomplishing his will. So a lot then falls on the notion of characterization. Just because the modes of Brahman are these constantly transforming, mutable subjects and objects, you can't characterize Brahman as mutable. You can't characterize Brahman as diverse, constituted by subjects and objects. So the modes are not the means by which you characterize Brahman. Because, as we've already seen, Brahman is maximal in a way in which the subjects and objects of the world, manifold world, are not. So quite a lot turns on this notion that you can describe the modality of the world as Brahman's manifestation, as effect, but nevertheless you cannot characterize Brahman. He does all of this through appeal to a complex grammatical notion, which he uses in a particular way, to which we're going to turn for the next few minutes. Similarly well-founded, he says, are the declarations of unicity, ekatva, since they establish coordinate predication through the body-self relationship as the primary meaning of the text. What is coordinate predication? He's going to use this grammatical concept to say how, at one and the same time, you can take everything of this world of diversity back to Brahman, and yet not limit Brahman by characterizing Brahman or God through these manifolds. How are you going to do that? Coordinate predication, is a syntactic rule that applies when a word expresses an effect of the ultimate self in conjunction with a word expressing that self in its causal state. Sentient and insentient entities in all their states derive their entitativeness, derive their existence as these particularities from being modes of the first person, insofar as they are his body. So that first person himself, with them as mode, is both cause and effect. And it is he who is expressed always by every word. So what coordinate predication does is to say, when you're talking about diversity, you are of course talking about diversity in a way that does not characterize Brahman, God. However, every word, every naming of everything goes back to that person, because all subjects and objects in this case are his body. I'm not going to spend time talking about the various metaphors that he uses. The idea that the world is the body of God is being well explored, is one way in which he talks about the relationship between the world and God. That's not my point of focus here. My point is this notion of coordinate predication. Repeatedly in different contexts, he says what happens with this coordinate predication is you predicate of the diversity of subjects and objects, what they are, in all their mutability, in all their diversity, in all their coming and going, in all their flaws. And that's the world. And insofar as they name these things, they're not naming God, who is absolute. However, those names do go back to God without characterizing God. They do, the predications are coordinated with God because there are these ways in which the being of God infuses the world. For example, in taking the world as God's body. So you've got to hold two different thoughts here, and that's what's supposed to be resolved by the notion of coordinate predication. You've got to be able to say that you have the characterization of entities in their entitativeness because they are modes of God. So you're not denying that there are all these objects and there are all these people. However, what you've got to remember is because they're modes of God, ultimately, what I call all the world goes up to God, the names, in fact, ultimately must refer to God without characterizing God. That is the function of this idea of coordinate predication. So to see another example, in the Upanishadic declaration, famously, you are that, Tatvamasi, it is Brahman who is expressed by the two words, that and you, applied by way of coordinate predication. There are not two things here. So you might think you are that means you are Brahman, and that you, who is separate, is in some way able to be Brahman. No, that's not what the text is saying. The word that declares him who is the cause of the world, Brahman is God, while you declare that very Brahman qualified by the mode that is the bodily individual. Since Brahman is the inner controller of that individual self, since Brahman is everywhere, the being of the individual is Brahman's being. So one can say that the two words that and you are applied to one and the same Brahman under different aspects. First, you do have to have a way of describing the entity that is you, the individuals. You are there. The function of ordinary language is there to say you are tall and you're old and you're young and so on and so forth. You're thoughtful, you're, whatever you want to say. That fills out that you. But because your you-ness is given by God's being, in talking about these entities, you're ultimately naming God. That's what he takes the ancient term you are that to be saying. Because everything not Brahman is an entity through being the body of Brahman. Even though a word names something in the world, it refers to it as something terminating in Brahman, going up to Brahman. Since it is established that all words refer to Brahman, as differentiated by whatever ontology have various objects, understood through daily etymology, in your normal language, you of course are perfectly capable of saying, here's a glass of water, and you're able to act accordingly. You're not saying Brahman is reaching out to Brahman and drinking Brahman, or the drinkingness is Brahman. You don't get that, because daily etymology allows you to distinguish these various objects. The coordinate predication of you you are that is a particular summation of the very meaning stated in all this has itself in that. So while you function in your daily etymology, always remember that the entitativeness of that glass and of the subject who's talking about it, whose bodily conduct allows it to be able to drink and so forth, all of that terminate in Brahman. That is the tension in which the plurality of the world must be held. The plurality is there through the daily etymology, and yet because you have the account that this plurality is Brahman in its modes of effect or its body, all the other metaphors he uses, you have to hold at one and the same time the capacity to use this pluralistic language in this world while also being aware that ultimately those words all go back, the names all go back to Brahman. I mean, I have to say at this point, the problem I've always struggled with in this account is not the notion of coordinate predication, is not the idea of the names going up to Brahman. It is the idea that in order to preserve the absolute oneness of Brahman, these are not characteristic of Brahman. So the Advaitin, for example, would say, well, these are all fundamentally erroneous because all of your referential actions are not ultimate. There is only Brahman. So the rigor of Brahman being absolute and therefore not characterizable, the phrase that we encountered in the very first lecture, neti, neti, not this, is systematically held by the Advaitin at the price of denying the reality of how daily etymology functions. However, for Ramanuja, that cannot be the case because this is a world in which this is God's world. We are, in some sense, have as God as our inner controller. So we are not, in some sense, illusory beings or penultimate beings. So having given that account of our derivative beingness from God, and in order to do so, saying that all of this language that we use and all those references ultimately go back to God, how he has to preserve the absolute oneness of God is to say, although these names refer to God, you nevertheless do not characterize God. God as God is in fact not touched because the maximality of God is not touched by the use of names which are not maximal. That is always the difficult place for this account. Now, all of this is a particular laying out of a metaphysics of oneness, which holds the diversity of the world with God. So what? How are we going to proceed from reading these texts to anything consequential? As we were seeing with Shankara, because for him, what is at stake is this misunderstanding of individual consciousness, that it is separate from the universal. The proper acceptance, the disciplined acceptance of these teachings has to culminate in the transformation of the apparent individuality of consciousness. We have the consciousness here has to de-individuate through a process, whatever that process is, as a consequence of understanding the nature of Brahman as laid out in the text. But that is because that self-realization is self-realization as Brahman. But Brahman here is God. And of course, you're not realizing you're God in the system. So what happens? Yes, you have to have a practice of reading and attending to what these texts are saying. But then what? Being about to investigate the practice of attention, upasana, the sacred text declares that the one who is attentive, you have to be attentive, on that Raman, he's agreed with Shankara, one who's attentive to the learning, one who concentrates on that learning, receives the fruit of attention, fulfillment. That is the attainment of the first person. Only from the first person himself. This is the point about self-disclosure that I'm talking about. Why so? Because only that is possible. You can't do it by yourself. This is the decisive disagreement with Shankara's system. For only he, all-knowing, all-powerful, of utmost nobility, being pleased by sacrifices, gifts, oblations, and so on, as well as attentiveness to the teachings, bestows fulfillment, which is attainment of intrinsic nature, similar to his own. Of course, that similarity of being is yet another place that needs further investigation. I'm not going to go into. What I want to focus on here is that once you have got to the point of attentiveness to all these teachings and their exegesis by an acharya, what happens? You can't go beyond that. You can only be given that. You can receive the fruit of fulfillment by God. God has to disclose godliness. You don't attain it through your own action. This is where you see the internal compulsion of Ramanuja to explain this relationship between the absolute Brahman, who's God, and this world of diverse beings and objects. Because for us, as these derivative beings who perform sacrifices and gifts and oblations and attend to the texts, what happens to us is that we have God graciously disclosing God's self to us. Therefore, minimally, there must be some distance in being between us and God. So you've got to hold together the absolute oneness by which all our being derives from God, and yet the sufficient distance in our being from God that God may disclose graciously God's nature, intrinsic nature. So how do you hold that? Is different, is not different. So I'll end with the sequence of thoughts that he expresses. The Lord with Sri, God as Vaishnavas conceive it, whose intrinsic essence cannot be distinguished because of absolute beingness of God by speech or thought, whose creative pleasure is to originate, sustain, and dissolve the entire world, filled as it is with an infinite and magnificent diversity of subjects and objects of experience, who is the ultimate Brahman. So this Brahman who is simultaneously indistinguishable beyond speech and thought in that absoluteness of being, but who nevertheless creates and contains this world of diversity. This Narayana, the first person, in his creation of the whole world, remains with his own essence, beyond the range of the meditation and worship of men and even celestials. Nobody can reach the absolute God in God's absoluteness. But being the shoreless ocean of compassion, gracious disposition, motherly love, and generosity, while never losing essence and attributes, maximal attributes, has assumed his own forms for the various beings and granted them what they prayed for, whether it is lawfulness, prosperity, enjoyment, or spiritual freedom, according to the fruit they sought. So, this is the account that Ramanuja has to give. His concluding position as a worshipper of Narayana Vishri is that if you were going to go with the pure description of Brahman without qualities in himself, in his own essence, he would be beyond the range, not just of our meditations and attention, but even of super beings like Brahma and the other celestials. But God chooses to disclose and give grace. So God is both beyond in absolute being and yet discloses to us. How is this possible? The mechanism for that possibility is what we have been exploring in the earlier part of the lecture. It's that metaphysics by which somehow the modality of being allows both for the absolute oneness of God and God's being and the existence, the flawed, imperfect existence of a diversity of subjects and objects, which come from God through Lila, through this creative play, in a way, unforced creativity, so that they may gain the disclosure of God. Without that underlying metaphysics of oneness and manyness, Ramanuja suggests, you cannot have a God that is at one and the same time beyond the reach of thought and yet self-discloses to us who think. Oh, it's got to